Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantirume Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas satbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amrutam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We begin today on verse number 192. We have been studying the different layers over the self, and the section that we are studying now is the fourth layer, the layer of the ego. And the ego primarily means the knowledge of this I sense, the sense of I. And this I primarily manifests in two ways. I as the agent of action. In Sanskrit it's called karta. And I as the experiencer. And the Sanskrit word for that is bhokta. So in this formulation, the fourth layer, although literally translated as the layer of knowledge, is really the knowledge of being the doer. And the fifth layer, which we will study later on, will be the knowledge of being the experiencer, the bhokta. Now, in this connection, last time we saw that there was this one adjective used before ignorance, and that was anadi, that is, it is without beginning. Now, although we saw briefly that the ignorance that is in our heart is often referred to as without beginning, what is literally meant by that? Well, literally it means without beginning, but the implication is that it's not really without beginning, but we don't know when it began. And the reason to make this nuanced clarification is that if something is really without beginning, it will also be without end. Birth and death are related. Only that which is born will die. If something is not born, there is no death. And therefore, if beginning is seen as the birth, and the end will be the death, and if ignorance does not have beginning, then it will not end. The problem with that literal understanding of beginningless is, if ignorance will not end, then we will never become free. So we say the goal of life is moksha, freedom, but our bondage at present is created by ignorance. And so if ignorance is beginningless, it automatically becomes endless also. So that is the doubt now the student places before the teacher. That's verse 192. Shishya uvacha Brahmenapyanyatha vastu jiva bhavav paratmanaha tadupadher anaditvat anader nasha ishyate. The disciple said, the Supreme Self may see itself as the jiva through delusion or some other way, Since its superimposition has no beginning, this was said in verse 186, it cannot be said to have an end. So that's the essential doubt. The ignorance that we have in our heart now, did it begin at some point, or is it beginningless? And the text itself has called it beginningless. The commentators explain it by saying, well, it's not really beginningless. It just means we don't know when it began. So that's the question. And the student then explains it further, why this is a problem. So verse 193. Atosya jiva bhavopi nityo bhavati samsritihi na nivarte tatan mokshaha katham me shri guru vada. That makes the jiva identity also eternal, which means the samsara can never end. How then will I attain freedom? Please tell me this, revered teacher. So this is how that connection is. The jiva means the individualized self. The true nature of the self is it is infinite, all-pervading. Because of ignorance, the self forgets that it is all-pervading. When it forgets that it is all-pervading, the self begins to see itself as limited. And that's who we are right now. We see ourselves as limited beings. Now, if this limitedness, this mortality, if this is created by ignorance, and if ignorance is eternal, then my limited nature also becomes eternal. And if this is eternal, I'm never going to get moksha. And so that is the doubt the student has. Now the teacher begins the answer. Verse 194. Shri Guru Ruvacha Samyak Prishtam Tvaya Vidvan Savadhanena Tachrunu Pramaniki na bhavati Bhrantya Mohita Kalpana. The teacher said, O wise one, your question is appropriate. Sometimes when the students ask a question that is right at that moment, it makes the teacher happy. And that's why he says, even to ask an appropriate question is a sign of wisdom. So he refers to him as, O wise one, your question is appropriate. Listen to this carefully. The identity of a deluded person is caused by error and is not confirmed as real. So we are kind of continuing with the discussion we have been having in the last few classes. How does error occur? Why does it occur? How can it end? So all the questions related to error, because the basic premise of Vedanta is that nothing has really changed. The Atman or Brahman is still, even at this very moment, Atman and Brahman. We might think of ourselves right now as these fragile, mortal, weak human beings. But we have not become like this. We just think of ourselves this way. So even at this very moment, every one of us is the infinite being. At this very moment, we are all immortal. There is no birth, there is no death. We are free right now. Even our seeking moksha is a kind of delusion. And that delusion is because we think we are in bondage. And because we think we are in bondage, we have to seek a way out of the bondage. A story that is sometimes told in the Vedanta tradition is that there is this one person going with a with a basket, a small little flat basket in hand. And someone asks him, "What's in this basket?" And he says, "I'm carrying a mongoose." Now, some of you may have seen, there is a very traditionally, they say the snake and the mongoose are traditional enemies. So the only creature that can defeat a snake or even kills the snake in combat is the mongoose. And so this person is carrying this in a basket, a mongoose. And someone says, "Why do you need mongoose?" But this person says, because he says, "Wherever I go, I see hundreds of snakes around me, just slithering everywhere. And therefore, the only way I can protect myself is through this mongoose. Even at this very moment, I'm seeing all these snakes." And of course, the person was like, "Well, I don't see any snakes anywhere." He says, "You know what? The snakes, it's in your head. You're imagining them. You're just imagining the snakes. You don't need a mongoose to get rid of them." And then this person opens the basket and says, as if the mongoose is real. So the idea is, the story is often told to say that in order to get rid of imaginary snake, you need an imaginary mongoose. A real mongoose cannot get rid of the imaginary snake. And that's the idea here, that if the ignorance itself is mysterious, I would like to say, that's the word that gets often used, or inexpressible, anirvachaniya. We saw this some time back, how you cannot say it is there, you cannot say it is not there. So it seems to be there, but is really not there. So to get rid of that kind of ignorance, you need that kind of knowledge. So you need inexpressible knowledge to get rid of inexpressible ignorance. Real knowledge if the ignorance were real, it could not be got rid by anybody, because the understanding of real, Sat, in Vedanta means that it is eternal. Vedanta does not believe in any temporary reality. And therefore, and that's the whole question really, if the ignorance is real, it can never go away. And the question would be, if it is unreal, then what's the problem? If it is unreal and we know it's unreal, no problem. But if it's unreal and we think it is real, there's a major problem. It's a little bit like if I'm dreaming and I find myself crossing the street in my dream, and if a big truck comes and knocks me over, and I'm bleeding and in great pain. Now, if at that moment, if I know that I'm only dreaming, I could actually enjoy that dream. But in the dream, if I don't know it's a dream, then that pain, that suffering, that blood is very real at that moment. And then I will need to be taken to a hospital, a dream hospital, and a dream doctor and a dream treatment will get rid of this dream accident. But all of that will need to be done. The only other way to not necessarily solve the problem, but to dissolve the problem altogether would be to just wake up. Because if I wake up, the truck has disappeared, the pain has disappeared, everything has disappeared. So you haven't really solved it, but you just dissolved the whole thing. But short of that, you have to do what needs to be done. And that's what the teacher is saying, that our identity, present limited identity, is caused by error, and it is not confirmed as real. It's not really real. Verse 195. Bhrantim vina tvasangasya nishkriyasya nirakritehe na ghate tartha sambandho nabhaso nilatadivat. Unattached, formless, and beyond activity, the self cannot connect with any object without being deluded, as in the case of the sky and its blue color. So all of these connections that the self has, the connection of the Atman with the body, the connection with the Atman with the mind, and our connection with the world through the body and mind, all of these connections are possible only when the self is deluded. When the self wakes up, the body and mind themselves lose their reality, and everything else connected through the body and mind automatically also loses its validity. And that is what is being said here, that in reality, the Atman is unattached, is formless, and beyond activity. And right now, our experience is just the opposite. We are attached, but attachment is not necessarily, we use the word attachment on one specific way, but it just means also the connections we have with this world. That connections can come through the different relationships that we have, the different identities that we have, even the relationship with the material objects that we possess. I can speak about my home, my car, my friends, my country. So all of these connections that are established, that shows we are not really unattached. This Atman is unattached. So right now, we are attached. Formless. Well, if everyone believed they were formless, nobody would want a mirror at home. So it's very clear. You can just see in the course of a day how often we look at the mirror. Or if there is a group picture, and if you are present in that group, you will see invariably most people, if you are a part of that picture, the first person we would look is ourselves. Then we would see how others are in that group. So there is this very strong identity with form, our own, what we see as, which we feel as our own form. And then beyond activity. And we know that, as Krishna points out in the Gita, nobody can stay even for a moment without activity. Even physically to sit without movement is not possible beyond a certain limit. Gradually you'll find, of course, there's inner movements, some of these inner movements we can't stop at all. The pumping of blood and the breathing, but if that stops, then everything stops. If we are alive, then some inner movement in the body occurs, but even externally, physically as well, it's very difficult to just be motionless. And if that's difficult enough for the body, we know how much more difficult it is for the mind. It's only in a perfect meditation that the mind can be just still. And that's why the imagery that is often offered is that of a lamp, an oil lamp, in a place where there is no movement of air at all, no wind at all. So just like that flame would be just steady, without any kind of a movement. If the mind can reach that state, that would be what happens in perfect meditation. But right now, everything, the body, the mind, everything is moving. And that's why we haven't yet gone beyond activity. And so right now our experience is just the opposite because of delusion, because of wrong understanding. And that can be removed only through knowledge. verse 196. Swasya drashtur nirgunasya kriyasya pratyadbodhananda rupasya buddhehe bhrantya prapto jiva bhavo na satyo moha paye nasti avastu svabhavat. The Atman is the witness beyond qualities and activities, and its nature is inner awareness and bliss. Its jiva identity, resulting from the superimposition of the intellect, is not real. Being unreal by nature, it vanishes when the delusion is destroyed. It's pretty obvious, very clear. So our present identity, because it is unreal, it can vanish. If it were real, it would never vanish. So reality, as I said, there is no such thing as a temporary reality. Yes, things could be unreal, might appear to be real for a while, but that doesn't make them real. It's only an appearance. Verse 197. Yavad bhrantis tavadevasya satta mithya jnano jrumbhitasya pramadat rajvam sarpo bhranti kalina eva bhranter nashe naiva sarpopi tadvat. Produced by an error due to false perception, the jiva's apparent existence lasts only as long as there is delusion. This is like the snake which is perceived instead of a rope only during the state of delusion. When the delusion ends, there is no snake. Again, very straightforward, very simple, that we see the snake only as long as we are deluded. When the delusion ends, we see the rope. Similarly, we see and feel and think of ourselves as these limited mortal human beings only as long as we are deluded. When this delusion ends, where we formerly saw a limited mortal human being, there we see this infinite immortal Brahman. So just a change of perception occurred when any kind of a delusion vanishes. 198 and 199. Anaditvam avidyayaha karyasyapi tatheshyate utpannayam tu vidyayam avidyakam anadyapi prabodhe swapnavat sarvam sahamulam vinashyati anadyapidam no nityam pragabhava iva sphutam. Ignorance being without beginning, its effect must also be likewise. Nevertheless, when knowledge dawns, all effects of ignorance, even if without beginning, disappear along with their cause, like a dream upon waking up. Even if without beginning, ignorance is not eternal, as in the case of a prior non-existence. So, the same idea is being emphasized with some additional information. So there is a technical category, often discussed in the school of philosophy called Nyaya. And sometimes you'll find in Vedanta discussions also, some of the categories that are often referred to in other schools of thought are brought in to clarify a certain point. So there is one category called prior non-existence. The Sanskrit word for that is prak abhava. Prak means before, abhava means absence or non-existence. So it's like this. For instance now, this object. Clearly this object had a beginning. Somebody collected the raw material, gave it this shape, and that's how you could say this bowl is born. Now, this bowl did not exist as the bowl before. I mean, yes, the material existed and all of that, but as a bowl, this had a beginning. But before it was born, before this was manufactured, it didn't exist. So the non-existence of this bowl before it was manufactured, when did that non-existence begin? And we'll say, well, until this was manufactured, it didn't exist at all. And so you could say that its non-existence was without beginning. Because when did it begin? When did the non-existence of anything begin? It's impossible to say that. And yet, that non-existence of this bowl before its manufacture, that non-existence ended the moment this bowl was manufactured, because now it's existing. So that's the idea here. So just as the beginningless non-existence of this bowl can end with its manufacture, so the beginningless ignorance of the jiva can end when knowledge comes. So that's one example given here to show how something could be thought of as beginningless and yet it can end. Again, as you can see in the note, we could also apply the same principle to our dream. And I like to think about it this way. Let's say you go to sleep at 11 o'clock at night. And after switching off the light, turning and twisting in your bed for a while, and if you are lucky enough, may say in 15 minutes you're asleep. I don't know how many people manage that, but some people do. And so let's say you are asleep within 15 minutes, and let's think that 5 minutes after you're asleep, so at 11:20, your dream begins. So if your dream began at 11:20 at night, and say by 5 minutes into your dream world, you just go out for a walk, and then you meet your grandfather on the way who's coming from the other side. And then in that dream, when you're walking by the river, although the river, yourself, your grandfather, they all were born just 5 minutes before. All of them were born at the same time because the dream world started at 11:20, and you are now at this time frame of 11:25. Although all of them were created or born or came into being at the same time, we don't feel it that way in the dream. If I see the river, I think the river has been around for a much longer time than I am. If I meet my grandfather in my dream, I feel he's older than me. He has been existing for a longer than I am. And yet, I just feel that these differences exist. But from the perspective of a person who knows it's a dream, he said, this dream had a beginning. It began at 11:20. But in my dream, I think that world that I encounter has been around forever. I mean, and of course, that's true right now as well. If you walk along the river, you walk along the Charles, how many people can say that Charles and I came into being at the same time? Or you look at the mountain and say, this mountain and I were created at the same time. We don't feel that way. And that is a part of the delusion. But from the perspective, just like from the perspective of the person who is awake, the dream had a beginning and the dream does end. So from the perspective of the enlightened being, this jiva nature, this had a beginning and had an end. But when we are inside the ignorance, it feels as if it is beginningless. That's the idea. Words 200 and 201. Anaderapi vidvamsaha pragabhavasya vikshitaha yad buddhyopadi sambandhat parikalpitamatmani jivatvam na tato anyat tu swarupena vilakshanam sambandhastvatmano buddhya mithya jnana purassaraha. Even if without beginning, prior non-existence is seen to have an end. This is what I said about the example about the bowl. There is no jiva identity different from the one superimposed on the Atman by its imagined association with the intellect. The association of the Atman with the intellect is the result of false knowledge. So all of these connections that we have, all of these false connections that the Atman makes, the Atman is detached. Atman is not attached to anything because there is really nothing apart from the Atman. The Atman alone exists. So when the Atman becomes ignorant, it becomes limited, it begins to see people, objects, things, places around, and starts making all these connections. And that is what is said here. The association of the Atman with the intellect is a result of false knowledge. All of this is a result of ignorance. And ignorance, another way of referring to ignorance is false knowledge. Because as we saw in the earlier, ignorance has two powers. One is called the power to hide. It's called avarana shakti. And the second is the power to project, vikshepa shakti. So if all that the ignorance did was just to hide the reality, I mean, it's bad enough. But what makes it worse is not that it simply hides the reality, it projects something else in its place. If the room were pitch dark and you wouldn't even see this rope, and if you're looking for a rope and you won't see it, I mean, that's bad enough. But in place of the rope, you see a snake. The absence of the rope will not cause terror in you, but the appearance of a snake is going to cause a lot more pain and suffering. So that's what the ignorance does. If it simply hid things, okay, bad. But after hiding, it projects a monster in its place, then that's the problem. And that's worse than simply hiding. So that is what is often referred to as false knowledge. The knowledge of the snake is false. The knowledge of the rope is the true knowledge. 202. Vinivrittir bhavet tasya samyak jnanena nanyatha brahmatmaikatva vijnanam samyak jnanam shruter matam. If it, that is, the jiva identity, is destroyed by true knowledge, not by any other means. According to the Vedas, experiencing the self and Brahman as identical is true knowledge. Very clear, unambiguous statement. What is true knowledge? That the self that I see within me, the I, and this cosmic reality, when I feel I'm one with everything, there is nothing apart from me, I alone exist, that is true knowledge. And this ignorance, my present ignorance, can be removed only through knowledge, not through anything else. And this, right in the beginning of the book, we saw why knowledge is the only means. Because the problem is ignorance, and ignorance can be removed only through knowledge. Just as darkness cannot be removed if you have a gun and swords. You can't remove darkness. In order to remove darkness, you'll need light. Now, sometimes these statements are misunderstood and creates confusion. When I said the problem can be solved only through knowledge, because we also speak about the 4 yogas, and one of the yogas we speak about is the path of knowledge. So we have to distinguish those 2 things. Yes, ignorance can be removed through knowledge, but that knowledge can come through bhakti, through God's grace, through devotion, through path of bhakti yoga, that knowledge can come, through the path of jnana, that knowledge can come, through the path of karma yoga, that knowledge can come, through the path of raja yoga, that knowledge can come. So all of these 4 yogas, their starting points might seem different. A different function of the mind may get emphasized in some of the practices within those yogas. But the ultimate result that these yogas lead to is producing the knowledge that will remove this ignorance. So when it is said that knowledge alone can remove ignorance, some people wrongly think, oh, then this path of devotion and bhakti is meaningless. That's not the meaning. The meaning is bhakti will ultimately lead to knowledge. Jnana will ultimately lead to that highest knowledge. Same with selfless work. Same with meditation and the control of the inner thing which Raja Yoga teaches. So all of these yogas will ultimately give us the same knowledge. 203. Tadatmanatmano samyak vivekenaiva siddhyati tato vivekah kartavyah pratyagatma sadatmanoho. So that is attained only through discernment between the self and the non-self. Therefore, discernment or viveka between the inner self and the false self must be practiced. It's so inspiring. This is so logical. There is no ambiguity here at all. That my false self, this wrong understanding that I have now, this is the result of ignorance. And this has to be removed, and this can be removed only through knowledge. In order to know what is right and what is wrong, in order to know what is reality and what is not real, I need to look deeply there. And that is what discernment is. Looking carefully, looking deeply. Superficially looking at things is not going to solve the problem. So if I can look carefully, then I will know exactly, oh, this is what which appeared real is not really real. There's something else which I had not even noticed. That's the reality behind it. It's almost like if you are watching a movie and you get so immersed, so absorbed in that story, that after some time you might even forget. You can even forget that you are sitting in a movie theater watching it, but you might also forget that behind where the movie is being projected, there is this screen. If the screen were not there behind, you wouldn't be able to see the movie. But we completely forget the screen. But while you're watching the movie, even if for a short time, you suddenly remind yourself, oh, this is only a movie. This is not reality. The reality is just the screen behind. Maybe you may not enjoy the story much afterwards. Or maybe you might. Maybe you might then be able to notice things in that movie which you otherwise wouldn't have noticed. Think about it this way. It's good to get absorbed into the movie you see and enjoy the story and whatever the lessons, if that story has any lessons, learn from it, which is good. But while you are watching the movie, if you become aware, oh, this is only a movie, this is not real, then maybe, depending on your interest and depending on what you're looking for, you might be able to notice how wonderfully the movie is directed. You might be able to see the different angles from which the cinematographer, the cameraman sees. You might be able to appreciate that. You might be able to actually, there are a lot of things. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that sometimes being too absorbed in the story, we miss probably 90% of the details. Of course, not the essential details, otherwise you wouldn't follow the story. But there are lots of interesting things. I have had some experience earlier in life about how movie making is done, and I also knew a few folks who were engaged into that. And it's so fascinating in some ways, depending on the time frame of the story. Suppose it's a historical piece. And so let's say the story occurs sometimes in the 1940s or 1930s. And if the scene being shot is inside a room, and provided, of course, that these are really good filmmakers, that they take their job seriously, they take a lot of trouble in even having every object into that room identical with how the architecture was, how the things were used, what kind of things were used in 80, 90, 100 years ago. There's a lot of thinking goes into that. And maybe in the story, that particular scene might not last for more than 45 seconds or a minute. And when we are absorbed into the story, we're not looking at what things are on the table and what kind of all of these details are missed. In a subliminal way, it does create the sense that this particular thing, the scene unfolding before me, occurred 100 years ago. But actually, it just occurred maybe a few months before in some big studio somewhere. So if we remember that it's a movie while you're watching it, then some of these other finer details, which we would have otherwise missed, we will be able to notice. And that's essentially, I'm mentioning all this to show that if we look deeply, we will notice things we wouldn't otherwise notice. And this is not just about movies. It's also about the work in which we are engaged in on a daily basis. It's also about the people we live with. It's also about our own selves. Sometimes we are so caught up in this fast pace of life and the world. It's always about what's the next thing I have to finish. This is my to-do list. And so very few people, especially I would think, I was about to say, make too much distinction between city life and rural life, but I don't think there is that much difference really. It's just that the concerns are different in urban areas and in rural areas. But I do think that for most people, we finish one task and the mind immediately is like, I've got to do that next. I've got to finish this. I've got to finish that. And the problem is that this is never going to end. This will happen until the moment we drop dead. Because sometimes we make the mistake of thinking, oh, right now I'm so busy, and we have some kind of a mythical idea in our head that, oh, now after some time when things are just going to calm down and then everything will be still, and that's the time I'll be able to do what I want to do. But right now, I need to finish all these things. But what most people have discovered, that time rarely comes. Life has a way of putting us these different goalposts before us. Oh, let me just finish that. Oh, then when you finish that, then something else comes up. And suddenly we wake up one day and find, oh, 50 years of my life are gone. Someday we might find, oh, just the other day I was a young kid and now I'm so old. Now I have children and grandchildren of my own. How did this time go? Where did it go? And it just went because I was just looking from one task to the next task. So again, if we pause, if we look deeply, that's what Viveka means, that's what discernment means. Not that we have to not do what we are supposed to do. Yes, we have to, all of us. We can't stop we can't stop activity at all, as we saw before. But if we do it with discernment, then we realize that I have got to do what must be done. And that is, first thing is to look clearly, look deeply. When I look deeply, my priorities in life become clear. I'll be able to know which things need more attention, which things can wait. Otherwise, it's just going to be one unending chore after another. And that's why this importance of discernment between the self and the non-self. And that discernment, for the discernment between the self and non-self will manifest itself in discernment between everything else. What is healthy for me, what is not healthy, what is right, what is wrong, which will take me nearer to God, which will take me away from God. But all of this will happen only if I look deeply. So 204. Jalam pankavada spashtam pankapaye jalam sphutam yatha bhati tathatmapi dosha bhave sputa pravaha. Very clear and a good example. Muddy water is unclear. Just as water becomes clear when the mud is removed, the Atman also shines brightly when its defects are removed. Now, Atman is perfect. So, what are Atman's defects? Well, defects are that which is superimposed on the Atman, basically beginning with ignorance. 205. Asannivruttau tu sadatmanas phutam pratitire tasya bhavet pratichaha tato nirasaf karaniya eva asadatmanaf sadva hamadi vastunaha. When the unreal is eliminated, the innermost real self is experienced directly. Therefore, the false self, made up of things like the ego, must be completely eliminated. Very clear. And finally, as was done in the earlier layers, this section concludes with showing why this ego is also a layer. That is, ego is not the Atma, ego is not the self. And the reason is given in verse 206. Ato nayam paratma syat vijnanamaya shabda bhak vikaritvat jadatvacha parichinnatva hetutaha drishyatvat vyabhicharitvat na nityo nitya ishyate. So 5 different reasons are given why the ego is not the Atman. The layer of knowledge is not the Supreme Self because 1, it is prone to change. 2, it's insentient, it's not conscious, it's limited, it's an object of perception. That's how we become aware of the ego, and liable to become non-existent, as in deep sleep. A transient entity cannot be the eternal self. So for all of these reasons, all of which we have discussed in the earlier verses, the ego is also a layer. So this brings to an end the section on the ego as the doer. So the next time we meet, we will go to that last layer, called the layer of bliss, but it's really the layer of the ego as the experiencer. So we'll study that next time. So if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, yeah.
Namaskar, Maharaj. We saw that during the dream state, we see that river, my grandfather, we are born at the same time, because it came with my dream, and dream started like 5 minutes ago. And that, so we see, but then as soon as the dream is broken, I feel, oh, I'm glad that it is not real. So it is very easy to see that the dream world is unreal, asat. Now, how do I understand or explain myself that in the Jagrata Avastha, waking world is unreal? Because it is in front of me. And the same thing my father saw, the same thing my grandfather saw. So what is the best way to understand or explain to myself that the world is unreal? Is it
good? That's a good question. Yes, yeah, please sit. It's not really possible to prove that the world we experience is unreal. What we can do is raise reasonable doubts about its existence. And by that I mean that just as in my dream, although everything in my dream and everyone in my dream were created at the same time, and yet I felt that no, they are created at different times. My grandfather is older than me. The rivers and mountains are much older than all of that. So from the dream we learn that it is possible for something completely non-existent to suddenly appear out of nowhere and give me a sense of reality. Although when I wake up in the morning, I know it's unreal. So this much is clear from the dream, that something can be unreal yet appear as real. One other thing we know from the dream is, in the dream, I don't know it's a dream. But isn't that exactly the same situation exists right now? This appears real, just like the dream appeared real to me in the dream. Even here now, things and people seem to have come at different points in history. There is evolution. It took some things have taken millions of years. All of this. And yet, all of this could have come at the same time. Along with the idea that it has come at different times. In fact, this was a question once asked to Holy Mother, Sharda Devi. One of the disciples asked the mother, Mother, has the world evolved gradually, slowly? And that's how, we have all this theory of evolution and all of that. Or everything had just come at once. And it's fascinating without the least hesitation, Mother says, everything has come at once. Now we might think that this completely invalidates the theory of evolution and all of that. Actually, it doesn't. So what Mother is saying really, I think, is everything has come at once, along with the idea that things have come one after another. So the theory of evolution is as much a product of creation as everything else is. So as long as we are in this bubble, yes, of course, things have taken millions of years to evolve. But from the dream experience, we know that everything can come at once. So if we keep these the things in mind, begin to see the similarity between what we call the waking state and how similar it is to what we call the dream state, then we might think there is not much difference. Or at least, and this is nothing specifically Vedantic about it, because in the writings of Plato, we find this. It's amazing. He says, he puts it in a different way, in a negative way. He says, there is no way to prove that what I'm experiencing now is not a dream. It really can't be done. All that we can do is raise reasonable doubts about it. So one other related question might be, how do we define a dream? Why is what I saw last night a dream, and why is this not a dream? Why do we call this a waking state? Why do we call that a dream state? And one way of defining dream, in Sanskrit they say, ayathartha darshanam, seeing what is not there. We are able to dismiss the dream because, it's not really there. So a dream can be defined as seeing something that is not there, or seeing something which is not true. Now, from a Vedantic perspective, what is true or what is real is the Atman. Everything else is untrue. And therefore, that dream is a dream, pretty obvious to us now. But this also is not there, because the Atman alone is true. So this is another dream. Going a step further, even what we see and experience in the deep sleep state, in the Sushupti, that's not the Atman either. So that is another dream. And therefore there is this Upanishad called the Aitareya Upanishad, which just says, Tatra Traya Swapnaha. There are three kinds of dreams: waking dream, dream, deep sleep dream. So for an advanced student, in the beginning, yes, we can say there are these three states. If you want to make it even more complicated, and that's human nature, simple to complicate simple things. So there's a book called, I think it's called Yoga Vasishta Sara, which subdivides these three states. Ultimately, they, I think, go something like 24 states or something. So there are people who speak about the intermediate state, the threshold state between sleep and dream, the threshold between dream and deep sleep. I mean, we can easily keep on complicating it further. But the simplifying would be to reduce the number of categories. And so we have now reduced it to three: waking, dream, and deep sleep. But for advanced students, they see that these three are not really different. Neither of them gives me an experience of the reality. They are all dreams. So they are all three different kinds of dreams. Swami Vivekananda explained this in a more radical way. So what he said was that every night we don't just see one dream. We think we see one dream. Many of us see several dreams. We just don't remember them. If at all we remember our dream, it's usually the last dream before waking up. That's like the fresh one in the mind. That's what we remember. What Swami Vivekananda said was, just as waking, dream, and deep sleep can all be dreams, we can think about death as another dream. We can think about going to heaven and staying there for a while as heaven dream, or going to hell and suffering as a hell dream. Being reborn, rebirth as another dream. So our entire present experience can be seen as just a series of dreams, unending dreams. One dream following another dream. And these dreams will not end. The only way for the dreams to end is for me to wake up. If I don't wake up, these dreams are going to go one after another. And that's the idea. Yeah, David.
So am I correct in assuming then that practices like japa, meditation, visualizing, or divine ideal, I mean, those are ways to practice waking up? And
absolutely.
If so, how do those things work?
Yes, yeah, good question. What japa and devotional practices do, it's like cleaning the windshield of your car. It makes the mind transparent. What makes the mind distorted, the lens of the mind distorted and colored, is all these desires, all these wrong understanding of the material world. And what meditation, japa, devotional singing, selfless work will do is purify the heart. If it purifies the heart, it makes the mind clear. The more the mind becomes clear, it is able to see things clearly. That's where this deep looking comes. If the glass of the mind, the lens of the mind is clear, whatever it sees, it will notice things it hadn't noticed before. And that's when I'm able to distinguish between what is right and wrong, what is self and non-self. So all of these practices, ultimately, they go to purify the heart. And that's why Swami Vivekananda once said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Even that one statement has so much truth behind it. Because ultimately it's this clouding of the mind, clouding of the heart that has produced all these distortions. So when that heart is purified, we see things as they are. Yes.
Swamiji, we all sort of pride ourselves of acquiring knowledge, and we think that the knowledge will lead us somewhere along the line to discernment at some point. When you look at the lives of the great people like Jesus, who went to the mountain and found out the knowledge he wanted, or Moses went to, or Buddha, who was going around, and even Swamiji himself went around. So how do these people distinguish from us who are mortal, also similar people, but we try to kind of not get to that level of even thinking that how that knowledge will ever come to us?
Okay, good point. Yes, there are several ways of understanding this. One way of understanding that is that the 2 or 3 examples that you referred to, about Jesus, the Buddha, and all these great ones, one way of distinguishing them from us is that they had a much larger mission in life. That it was not just getting knowledge for themselves, but the fruits of that knowledge, because of the enormous power they exerted, that was able to benefit not only themselves, their contemporaries, but down the centuries, people until today. Even many of these people have been around or were existing historically centuries ago. but their power, their knowledge, their insights, their teachings continue to benefit us. So in that sense, it's not necessary for every one of us to become whatever these incarnations and saviors and prophets were. But when I get that knowledge will not be essentially different from the knowledge that Buddha and Jesus got. But it's not necessary for me then to go and revolutionize and change the whole world. It's enough for me to become enlightened and wake up. My dream ends. Sri Ramakrishna once said that if someone goes to a bar to drink, and if that person is just having one bottle of alcohol is enough for that person to feel fine or enjoy, that person doesn't need to know how much alcohol the bar is storing or how much they're ordering. That knowledge is superfluous. What is enough? If little bit of is enough for me, that's enough for me. So that's how a spiritual seeker sees. That yes, I have this ignorance. All that I need is to remove this ignorance. I don't have to do what Jesus or Ramakrishna or Buddha did. But their teaching, their inspiration shows me the way. I can follow what they have taught me. But in order for me to be free, I don't have to become an incarnation. I can be free in my present state as well. That's the idea. Yeah. Okay, so we will stop here today. So this will be our last class before we close for the summer recess. So the next time we meet will be in mid-September. So we have, by which time, of course, we have now theoretically studied the 4 layers. And if you continue to practice, maybe when we meet in September, we'll be just having 1 layer around us. And then we can then deal with that. That'll be so much easy to deal. And so let us use this 4 or 5 weeks we have in the middle to, I hope you enjoy the rest of the summer, but also if you find time and opportunity to kind of go back to some of these verses we have studied in the last few weeks and read them. That will kind of bring back all the ideas and thoughts associated with it. What is important is to not keep all of this simply at the cerebral level. This is not simply for intellectual stimulation that we are studying all this. All of this has the potential, has the power to change our lives. This has the power to enlighten us. This has the power to wake us up. And so it's not just for just some intellectual kicks, so to speak. And so please try to reflect on it. Please try to find its connection with your own life. See whether this knowledge, these insights are helping you see things clearly, helping you deepen your spiritual life. Because ultimately that's the goal. Ultimately that's what's going to matter. Whether I become a better human being, a deeper person, more mature, more spiritually perceptive. That's the goal. So we will meet next sometime in mid-September. So going forward, this Saturday we will not have meditation, but this Sunday will be our last satsang before the recess. So we will see that. So now we'll stop this. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. So, as I was saying, this Sunday will be our last satsang. We have a guest speaker, Pravrajika Vrajapranaji. She is a senior nun of the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Santa Barbara. Some of you may have heard her. She was here last year as well. So she will speak on a subject will be, how can I help? So please come for this last satsang before we have a break for the summer. So we'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.